WFYI podcast brought to you by Bloomington, Indiana, an American college town offering food and drink, college sports, outdoor activities, live music, cool art, and good times daily. Everyone is welcome in Bloomington. More information at visitbloomington.com.
This is WFYI News Now. It's April 23rd, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, Indiana educators need literacy training, and it's facing strong opposition. Eclipse gazers at the Indianapolis Children's Museum may have been exposed to measles from an out-of-state visitor. And Hoosier legend Carl Erskine passed away last week at the age of 97. A recent documentary about his contributions to sports and society explored his legacy.
He's best known for being a baseball player, but that's not in the least why I did this film. It's because he was an absolutely incredible human rights champion.
Those stories coming up, but first, an event this week will provide reentry resources for formerly incarcerated people in Indianapolis. The Reentry Resource Fair is hosted by several local organizations, including Fathers and Families Center, Recycle Force, and Trusted Mentors, to help newly released prisoners find community support services. Kedrian Brewster is a reentry advocate from Dallas. He spent over 13 years incarcerated, entering prison at 17 years old. After his release in 2014, he says he struggled returning to society, especially with new technology.
I had never dealt with social media. All these things were new to me. Having to learn I can do online banking, knowing how to download apps, all that was new to me.
Now, the 40-year-old owns his own trucking company, is a published author, and travels the country advocating for reentry assistance. Brewster will give a keynote speech at the event highlighting his experience.
Allowed me to show you how a kid who grew up gang banging and robbing has now become an individual that's the face of reform.
The fair, which is at Martin University this Wednesday, will provide resources including legal, insurance, transportation, housing, and voter registration services. The Science of Reading is a body of scientific research about how children learn the building blocks of literacy. A law requires schools to begin using the method this year. From WFYI's Education Desk, Rachel Fredette reports on how one big step in the process to teach educators this science was met with strong opposition.
Educators with a license to teach preschool to 6th grade or special education must learn how to use the science of reading. Each of those teachers are required to complete 80 hours of training, take a test, and pass it. The state's Department of Education unveiled its plan this month. Indiana State Teachers Association President Keith Gamble says teachers don't have enough information yet.
They weren't even able to get clear direction from their school district, and so it just shows a complete disrespect.
Incoming teachers have to complete literacy training beginning in July 2025 before they go for an initial license. Current teachers must do the same on or after July 2027, or until they move to renew their teaching license. The Education Department says they will continue to answer questions from educators. I'm Rachel Fredette.
Eclipse gazers at the Indianapolis Children's Museum may have been exposed to measles from an out-of-state visitor on April 8th. WFYI's Zach Castle reports that according to the Marion County Public Health Department, public health risk is low.
If infected, symptoms should appear by April 22nd through April 29th, according to a release from the health department. Symptoms include fever, cough, a runny nose, pink eye, small white spots in the mouth, or a rash. Most infections are mild or moderate, but measles is an extremely contagious virus. Children under 5, pregnant people, and immunocompromised people are at higher risk for serious illness. Immediately contact a healthcare provider or emergency room after noticing symptoms. Most doctors' offices in the county health department offer a vaccine. No cases have been reported in Marion County this year. For WFYI News, I'm Zach Castle.
And for our final story today, Indiana native baseball legend and human rights advocate Carl Erskine passed away last week at the age of 97. WFYI's Jill Sheridan sat down with Ted Green, a documentary filmmaker and friend of Erskine's, to talk about his legacy.
Now, your documentary, The Best We've Got, 2022 documentary, why were you inspired to make this documentary about Carl?
as I had sort of moved along in my film career after starting kind of late in life, I've come to try to focus on celebrating the triumph of the human spirit. I was able to do that with Crispus Attucks, with Slick Leonard, definitely with Eva Kor, all of which I partnered with WFYI on, and I'm grateful for that. But I tell you, with Carl Erskine, it's just over the top. I mean, he's best known for being a baseball player, but that's not in the least why I did this film. It's because he was an absolutely incredible human rights champion with a national, I'd say even international impact, but especially here in Indiana.
The incredible life that he had started in Indiana, in Anderson, Indiana, and as you mentioned, a human rights activist, some calling him the first white ally, all that starting in 1930s Indiana, small town. It's a little bit unexpected.
I'd say even more than a little bit. 1930s Indiana, not 10 years since the Klan actually ran the state, and of course it was still a horribly racially divisive time. And so Carl's one day, he's out there in an alley with a buddy and just shooting hoops, and up walks a 9-year-old black boy. Now, every force in society is pushing Carl away from this kid. But instead, Carl embraces him, asks him to play ball. 80 years later, they were still best friends and inspiring others. And in fact, there's a mural up right now in Anderson of Johnny Wilson, that little black boy, and that little white boy, Carl Erskine. So, I mean, it started early for Carl, and that, as he put it, prepared him for when he played on the Brooklyn Dodgers with Jackie Robinson, the first black player in Major League Baseball. While others weren't sure how to handle that on the team, and some handled it very poorly, Carl was the opposite. And Carl and Jackie grew very, very close, which we were able to explore in the film. And both of those guys, Johnny and Jackie, then prepared Carl and his wife Betty for their biggest challenge and their biggest joy. And that was the birth of Jimmy Erskine with Down syndrome in 1960.
And Carl, again, an enormous advocate. Talk about the work and how the documentary explores the work that he did.
I chose to do really a deep dive because I didn't want to just sort of start it in 1960 and look at the way things were, because frankly, I was fascinated just learning the history, learning about the evolution, looking at how horrible this country was and this state was in particular with people with intellectual disabilities, especially in the early 20th century. I mean, Indiana passed the very first compulsory sterilization law in the nation, and it was as sick as it sounds. So we go from there and flash forward to now, when by so many measures, Indiana is one of the very best in the country in that regard. Special Olympics' big push right now is for unified sports and athletes with and without disabilities competing together. Well, Indiana has by far the most high schools right now competing in that with unified sports. I was fascinated by that, and then to learn from so many people, the people in the state who would know, say it took a village, but the number one reason for that sea change was number 17, Carl Erskine. I mean, if I can say it, I think the best thing you can write about Carl Erskine is what's already etched onto Jackie Robinson, his buddy Jackie Robinson's tombstone, and that is, a life is not important except for the impact it has on other lives. I think that was what Carl Erskine embodied for nearly 100 years right here in Indiana.
Thank you, Ted, so much for sharing today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Drew Dodlin, Kendall Antron, who composed music for this podcast, and me, Abriana Heron. Our news director is Sarah Neal Estes. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.